He was queer, and his notions seemed to me odd, so that for a whole term I could not make up my mind whether he was a man of genius or merely an eccentric. At the end of his first term at Cambridge, he came to me and said, "Will you please tell me whether I am a complete idiot or not? If I am a complete idiot, I shall become an aeronaut, but if not, I shall become a philosopher." I told him to write me something during the vacation on some philosophical subject, and I would then tell him whether he was a complete idiot or not. At the beginning of the following term, he brought me the fulfillment of this suggestion. After reading only one sentence, I said to him, "No, you must not become an aeronaut." And he didn't.
What if most of philosophy isn't just wrong, but meaningless? Ludwig Wittgenstein argued that many philosophical questions aren't real problems at all, but confusions caused by language itself. To him, philosophy wasn't about creating theories. It was an activity, a way of clarifying thought by exposing where language leads us astray. He believed there was a strict limit to what could be meaningfully expressed, and anything beyond that limit was simply nonsense. Ludwig Wittgenstein was one of the most influential and controversial philosophers of the 20th century. His ideas changed how we think about language, logic, perception, ethics, and more. But his work is complex and open to many interpretations, making it difficult to pin down. Even today, his philosophy sparks debate. So who was Wittgenstein, and why does his work still matter? Let's dive in. Ludwig Wittgenstein was born in 1889 into one of Austria's wealthiest families. Despite his privileged upbringing, he was restless, always searching for deeper meaning. He first studied aeronautical engineering, but his fascination with pure mathematics led him to philosophy. This obsession took him to Cambridge, where he studied under Bertrand Russel. At first, Russel was skeptical, calling Wittgenstein obstinate and perverse. But within a year, he was convinced. Wittgenstein was a genius. Despite his brilliance, Wittgenstein was deeply unconventional. He would retreat into isolation for months at a time to think. When World War I broke out, he joined the Austrian army and was later captured. But even in war, philosophy never left him. During this time, he wrote what would become his first major work, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. In it, he famously declared that he had solved all philosophical problems. Believing his work was done, he gave away his fortune and tried to live a simple life, as a gardener, teacher, and even an architect. But philosophy pulled him back. In 1929, he returned to Cambridge, where his thinking took a dramatic turn. He abandoned his earlier ideas and developed a new approach to philosophy, shifting from strict logic to the complexities of ordinary language. This led to his second great work, Philosophical Investigations. Wittgenstein spent his final years refining his ideas, rejecting academic pretensions, and living on his own terms. Diagnosed with cancer, he continued working until the very end. In 1951, just before he died, his last words were, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life." Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus begins with a striking claim. The world is all that is the case. What follows is an ambitious attempt to define the relationship between the world, thought, and language, arguing that what can be meaningfully said must be structured logically, while everything else falls into the realm of the unsayable. First published in German in 1921 and later translated into English, the Tractatus emerged from Wittgenstein's engagement with the works of Frege and Russel. Russel, in fact, wrote the book's introduction, calling it an important event in the philosophical world. Wittgenstein, however, was unimpressed. He believed Russel had misunderstood the essence of the work, leading to an introduction that was, in his view, misguided. The structure of the Tractatus is itself a statement about logic and clarity. It consists of 7 numbered propositions, each expanding through increasingly detailed sub-propositions. And while much of the book is dedicated to precise logical analysis, It concludes in a way that is almost poetic. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. With this final proposition, Wittgenstein suggests that philosophy's true role is to clarify, not to speculate beyond the limits of language. Yet the work ends on a paradox. If the Tractatus itself outlines the limits of meaningful discourse, then its own claims about those limits seem to undermine themselves. Wittgenstein acknowledged this tension, likening the book to a ladder that must be thrown away once it has been climbed. It is a book meant to be transcended, leaving its reader in a place of clarity, only to recognize that some of the most important aspects of life, like ethics and metaphysics, cannot be captured in logical propositions at all. What remains is not just a work of philosophy, but an invitation to see the boundaries of what can be said and to recognize the silence beyond. Wittgenstein's shift from his early to later philosophy is one of the most important changes in 20th century philosophy. In his early work, Tractatus, he argued that philosophy should not be a rigid system or a doctrine, but rather a way of clarifying our thoughts. However, Wittgenstein later admitted that his early ideas were a bit too dogmatic, meaning they assumed there was a clear gap between questions and answers that would eventually be filled by logical analysis. This realization led Wittgenstein to change his approach entirely. Instead of trying to define the true nature of reality through logic, he began focusing on how language is used in everyday life. He realized that language isn't as structured and predictable as he once thought. In his later work, he explored how we actually use language to communicate and understand the world, and he replaced complex theories with simpler, more intuitive ways of looking at language and meaning. In 1953, Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations was published, bringing his new ideas to the world. This book is famous for its radical shift in thinking. Wittgenstein begins by challenging the traditional view of language, which said that words are simply names for objects. He argues that this idea doesn't capture the full richness of how language works in real life. Instead of treating philosophy as something that explains deep metaphysical truths, Wittgenstein now sees it as a way to clear up confusion. He believed that many philosophical problems arose because we misunderstood how language works. Philosophical Investigations is a therapeutic work. Wittgenstein thought philosophy should help us untangle the confusion we create with our language. One of Wittgenstein's most important ideas in his later work is that the meaning of a word comes from how it is used in language. This might sound simple, but it's a huge shift from the old view that words have fixed meanings that exist in some abstract space outside of our everyday experience. Wittgenstein compared words to tools in a toolbox. Just as different tools are used in different ways, words have different uses depending on the context. Rather than searching for one fixed definition of a word, we should look at how people use it in different situations. He urged us to stop overthinking meaning and just observe how language is used in real life. Wittgenstein introduced the concept of language games to describe the different ways we use language. A language game is any activity that involves using language, and there are endless possibilities. For example, when we tell a story, make a joke, ask a question, or give instructions, we're playing different language games. These language games don't all follow the same rules. Some involve serious conversation, while others might be playful or silly. Wittgenstein argued that there's no single essence of language that applies to all of these uses. Instead, words and meanings are connected by a family resemblance, a way of saying that words share similarities, but don't have a common core. One of the most famous ideas from Wittgenstein's later work is his exploration of rule following. He asks, how do we know if someone is following a rule correctly? The traditional view was that rules are abstract and fixed, and knowing the rule meant understanding this abstract concept. Wittgenstein, however, challenges this idea. He says that rules don't exist in the way we typically think. Instead, following a rule is more about how it's applied in practice. For example, if someone is told to keep adding 2 to a number, and then writes the sequence 1000, 1004, 1008. They might argue that they're following the rule correctly, but Wittgenstein questions if that's really the case. He suggests that there's no one way to prove that someone is following a rule, and that we can only judge rule following based on how it's used in context. Wittgenstein also critiqued the idea of a private language, one that only the speaker can understand. For a word or rule to have meaning, it has to be part of a shared public practice. If someone's language is just about their own private experiences, there's no way to check if they're using the words correctly. Meaning, for Wittgenstein, is something that depends on a shared understanding. Wittgenstein's later philosophy marked a profound shift in how we understand language, meaning, and the role of philosophy itself. By rejecting the dogmatic, system-building approach of his earlier work, and embracing the idea that meaning is rooted in the use of language, Wittgenstein opened the door to a more flexible, context-driven view of how we communicate and think. His ideas on language games, family resemblance, and rule-following reshaped not just philosophy, but also fields like linguistics, psychology, and cognitive science. Rather than offering rigid theories or universal truths, Wittgenstein encouraged us to look at the everyday use of language, revealing how many philosophical problems stem from misunderstandings of ordinary speech. His belief that philosophy should be therapeutic, helping us untangle the confusions caused by misused language, has continued to inspire generations of philosophers to rethink how we engage with the world through words. Wittgenstein's influence extends far beyond the philosophical community. His ideas have impacted areas as diverse as artificial intelligence, legal theory, and the philosophy of mind. In rejecting abstract systems in favor of practical, everyday language, Wittgenstein's work challenges us to reconsider not only how we do philosophy, but also how we live and communicate with each other. His philosophy remains a reminder that meaning is not something fixed or abstract, but something we create together through our shared practices. Wittgenstein's legacy continues to shape how we think about language, thought, and the very nature of human understanding.